G'day guys, Kenny Raceway here and welcome to my garage. Today we're going to do a bit of an instructional video today and show you how to change the brake pads on your KLR 650. So I've got my tools here and my bike and yeah, let's jump right to it and install pads front and rear. Alrighty guys, so the tools you'll need will be as follows. As you can see, changing your brake pads isn't that hard with the skill level being at all thumbs. And also parts wise we'll need front and rear brake pads, as you can see, to replace the old ones that are quite worn. Alrighty, so the first thing we're going to do is remove those two 5mm Allen key bolts on the side of the caliper there. Just undo them because they won't come all the way out just yet. Next thing we're going to do is remove the guide which holds the hose onto the side of the fork there. Just using your 8mm wrench and socket there, just undo that one. And of course, once you've removed that bolt off the side of the fork there, you can remove that plate, and it is good practice to put the bolt back where it came from so you don't lose it. Next thing that we're going to do is remove the caliper. Using a 13mm socket and a breaker bar of some sort, you can undo those two bolts on the side and then the caliper should just come off. Of course, once you get those two bolts undone, just make sure you support the caliper in some form just so it doesn't drop and damage the hosing. Wriggle that guy off and then you should be able to use some kind of bungee cord or tether to support the caliper. Do not by any means leave the caliper dangling by its hose because you will cause damage and you will be up for a new hose. Once you've supported the caliper properly, we can begin to remove the pads. Using a 4mm Allen key, you can push from behind the caliper and get those two retaining pins out. Once you've gotten those two retaining pins out, the pads should come out pretty easily. As you can see, I've taken out the inside pad first, it should just hinge out, and then the one behind, which is the outer pad, should push straight outwards. Alrighty, so the next part of the operation would be to push those pistons back into the caliper body and also that alignment bracket back onto the body as well. Pushing the pistons back into the caliper can be a little bit tricky. Just take your time and push them in evenly on both sides. You can either use a C clamp or an F clamp to push the pistons in a little bit easier, but as you can see I'm using my fingers here and it's not terribly too hard. If your bike is a little bit older or has been through quite a few brake pads, it might be a good idea to lube those calipers up. You can either do this by using some kind of brake caliper grease, you can get that from your local auto shop, or use some kind of lubricant. Once all that has been done, just make sure they're nice and even on both sides and you're good to go. So installing the pads would be the next part of the operation. Of course, using the smaller of the two brake pads, just insert that into the outer side of the caliper and then you can proceed to put the inner one in. Just make sure you use that hook there to hinge it down and push it into place. So once you've got the two pads installed there, just make sure that you've got plenty of room in between them for the rotor to clear. Once we've got that done, we can proceed to put the retaining pins in. So before we put those retaining pins back in, what we want to do is clean them off. As you can see, these ones here, they do have quite a lot of dirt and grime on them just from brake dust. Just clean it off with a rag soaked in methylated spirits or something like that. Repeat the same step for both pins and then we're good to go. So putting the pins back into the caliper is pretty much the reverse of taking them out. Just make sure that you've got a bit of lube on those pins there so they don't get hung up on the pads when you're actually trying to use them. So aligning these pins to go back through the caliper and the pads is sometimes a little bit tricky. The pads are actually spring loaded and they will pop up out of alignment of the actual holes. So be sure to hold those pads down and push the pins through at the same time. Now once you've got those two retaining pins back in, what you can do is proceed to tighten them down. You won't be able to do them down all the way, being that you've got the caliper kind of dangling around. But we'll do that once the caliper's on the bike. So with those two retaining pins in, it's time to refit the caliper to the bike. Of course, remove that little bungee cord there and you can proceed to slip the pads over the rotor and back in alignment with the two mounting brackets on the fork. Of course, don't forget to put the retaining bracket for that hose there back on, and it is always good practice to use some Loctite when you're doing these bolts back up, because it is a thumper, of course. So once you've gotten all those bolts in, what we can do is proceed to tighten down those retaining bolts. So of course, using your 5mm Allen key, do these bolts up. They're supposed to be done up to 17 Newton meters or 12 foot-pounds, but as you can see, I don't actually have a torque key that has an Allen key head on it. After we've done that, we can proceed to tighten down those caliper mounting bolts using a torque wrench and a 13mm socket. Just tighten those guys down. Just make sure when you're doing up these caliper mounting bolts that you do them up evenly, both top and bottom. This will ensure that the caliper seats correctly. Now the torque settings for these two mounting bolts are 27 Newton meters or 20 foot-pounds, depending on what kind of measure you use. So after you've done that, the next step would be to pull that brake lever. As you can see, the brake lever pretty much comes all the way to the bar. That's normal, just pump the fluid back into that caliper. Now sometimes what will happen is that you'll have a bit of excess fluid in the system. This can occur when you've had your brake fluid topped up when your pads have been worn. If this is the case, just take your Phillips head screwdriver and undo the top reservoir of your brake fluid. After you've got that top plate off your fluid reservoir, you can proceed to remove some of the fluid out of the reservoir. Using either a clean rag or some type of suction device, just remove a little bit of fluid from the system. Just make sure that after you've done so, that the fluid levels are correct using the guide on the side of the window there. It's always a good idea to check the levels while the reservoir is level and with the bar straight. If the levels are too low, you can add a little bit of fluid using either a .4 or a .3 fluid. Once all that is done, you can proceed to put the top cap back on the reservoir and tighten it down nice and securely and evenly. Make sure after you've done that to clean all the excess brake fluid off the housing and on the body of your bike, because brake fluid is pretty nasty stuff and it can actually destroy your paintwork. And that's all there is to do. As you can see, the pads that came out of the bike are pretty worn as compared to the new ones. As for replacing the rear ones, the installation is exactly the same, so I don't need to show that here, and you're good to go. Anyway guys, that's pretty much all there is to it. We've got new pads in our bike and we're all happy. Just make sure that you bed them in properly. The way that you do that is just ride up and down your street a couple of times and grab onto those brakes nice and firmly. Just do a couple of emergency stops to get those pads nice and seated. Yeah, but be a little bit careful over your first couple of rides, being that they are new pads. And yeah, thanks for watching guys. Please rate, comment, add and subscribe. And yeah, until next time, catch you in the next video.